Welcome to UK Book. I can't even get my words out. UK Crime Book Club, and I'm delighted this evening to be joined by best-selling author Jane Corry. And Jane is here tonight to talk us about her new book, which is recently out, called Coming to Find You. Welcome, Jane. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you for asking me. It's great to meet you.
So Jane is a best-selling author. This is her 8th novel, I believe, and it's set in a place that she knows very well, which is in Devon, in Sidmouth. Jane, would you like to tell us a little bit about it?
Yes, I will. And I'll start off by confessing that actually it's my 8th Penguin novel, but I have previously written 12 novels that have been published.
Wow.
They were in a different genre, in a different life, which I can tell you about later if you like. But this is my 8th in this kind of genre. So the idea for Coming to Find You actually settled in my head some years ago. And it's when we moved to Devon about 15 years ago. And I joined a gym and I overheard this chance conversation. And it went along the lines of somebody describing how locals had set fire to weapons at the end of the Second World War on the top of a local hill. So my rightly curiosity was unable to hold itself back, and I asked why. And they told me that many locals had been recruited by an organisation called loosely Britain's Secret Defences, or otherwise known as Churchill's Secret Army, to be trained in guerrilla warfare in the event of coastal towns in particular being invaded. And the idea was that locals had more of a knowledge of the lay of the land than the army. But what really, really piqued my interest was that these were, quote, ordinary men and women, that was a really important part for me, who had jobs such as running the bakers, being mums, running bed and breakfasts known as boarding houses, because they were targeted in particular because their jobs provided a great cover. So I kind of let that seed grow, and I wrote other books in between, but I couldn't get rid of this idea because it just seemed to be amazing that this could happen. And then I never have been able to get prison out of my head. I joked that I went from Woman's Own to prison, but what actually happened was that my job at Woman's Own ended just when my first marriage ended. I needed money, so I applied for a job at a high security male prison as a writer in residence. And there was a term known as the silent sentence, and that was what the relatives of murderers and rapists felt when they discovered that their loved ones had committed terrible crimes. They lived under this silent sentence of shame. So enter Nancy, my present-day heroine, whose stepbrother has committed an atrocity, gone to prison for life. She runs for safety to a home that was owned by her mother, which was once 80 years ago owned by her grandmother's best friend. So the house, Tall Chimneys, is the factor that binds them both. We've got two women who both live in Tall Chimneys 80 years apart. And somebody, a different person, is coming to get each of them.
Yeah, I mean, there's some real tense. I mean, as you said, it's told from the perspectives of Nancy and Elizabeth. And they're both really interesting and sort of strong characters in their own right, aren't they? And I think you've got Nancy in the present day and Elizabeth in the Second World War. I think what inspired you to sort of have these two women, because they have some, there's crossovers, isn't there, between them, but they're sort of years apart. But yeah, so what sort of inspired you to write that?
Well, during lockdown, I was going through the deeds of our house. I've always been fascinated by vibes that houses leave, and the fact that people, if you have an oldish house, and even if it's not terribly old, unless it's brand new, somebody has lived there before, someone's left their mark.
Yeah.
And I wanted to find out who lived in our house during the Second World War, because my dad, who passed away just before Christmas, kept saying, he was 99 when he died, kept saying that the virus was so much worse than the Second World War, and because there was no socialising. And I wanted to find out who lived in our house in the Second World War, so I went back through the deeds, and I found the name of the person who lived there, and I tried to find them, tried to trace them, but I couldn't. And then I imagined myself in that person's head, and our house used to be a bed and breakfast, which would have been known as a boarding house.
Interesting.
And so I imagined myself in Elizabeth's head. And as for Nancy, well, I think, I say to friends, you can take the girl out of the prison, but you can't take the prison out of the girl. And those 3 years I spent in the prison have left their mark. And I actually am a voluntary life story judge for something called the Kester Awards, which judges poetry and life stories that are written by men and women in prison. So once a year, I go up to Wormwood Scrubs and I leaf through various entries. So it keeps me in touch as well. And I have often wondered what it's like to find out that someone you love has actually committed an atrocious crime. And when I worked at the prison, they had something called Family and Friends Day, which I was astounded at when I found out. And people, their family and friends would come along. There would be a kind of gathering once every 3 months. And the idea was to try and promote socializing so that when people leave, they can try and get back to a normal life. They were also given lots of help with finding jobs, etc. Because if you don't give people help, they quite often, or statistics show that people then go out and commit more crimes, and so the circle goes on. So I can understand people who say, why should people have these advantages? But actually, it's more of a question of trying to protect society. Anyway, I met quite a lot of friends and relatives of people in prison. And all I can say is they weren't the kind of people that my previous persona had thought they might be. And Nancy was born from that. I have to say that my sister's called Nancy. So I said to her, do you mind if I use your name? Because I want to. And she said, as long as it's not somebody wet. And I said, no, it's definitely not someone wet. Karen, your face has disappeared from the screen.
Yes, I know. I seem to have frozen. I've just got a note from the other, from Sam, the other person, just to say that I've frozen.
You're back now.
Am I back now? Okay.
Yeah, you're back. Yeah.
Good. Yeah, I think there's a bit of a lag by the. And have I gone? Am I here? On mine.
You're there, gone. But you're static.
I think it's trying to catch up the feed because let me just do one more thing. I'm just going to refresh it again because. There. Am I back? Can you hear me?
Yes, you're back. Yeah. So Nancy was born, and I just thought that's quite funny because my sister's quite feisty. So and she and the name Nancy seemed to really work, and they just took on their own lives. It's my characters usually do, but in this book even more so. I felt, for me anyway.
I think so. I think as reading them, it was one of those books because it's got the dual timeline. You've got the story in the present and the story in the past, but at the end of each chapter you desperately want to know what's going to happen, and you know that you want to find out what's going to happen to the next one, but also there's the other voice as well, isn't there, in the book, the third voice, which we won't give too much away about, but is sort of telling another story alongside that. So Was that difficult to write, the three sort of? Did you write them together separately?
Well, I always write an anonymous narrator. I usually write an anonymous narrator in little bits through it. I think that, and I've done that from the beginning, right from the first Penguin book, My Husband's Wife. I feel it's a way of adding edge, adding tension, and getting people to guess. I'm one of these people that loves to guess what's happening when I'm watching something on telly or whatever. And this is what I wanted to do. The interesting thing about those strands are that at the end of the book, to make sure it all works, I just read the strands through consecutively because it's quite easy for things to go astray, especially after I fiddled with it, after the copy editors had a look at it and my editors had a look at it. But the idea was to make it very short and to bring in the detail of the timing of the night of the murder when Nancy's stepbrother committed this atrocious crime where Nancy possibly but we don't know it had something to do with it. So I literally go through precise time, starting from 5:25 p.m. or whatever, when Nancy's getting ready. And my background, as I mentioned before, is in journalism, and I wrote for women's magazines mainly. And we were always taught the detail. So I was once, as a fledgling journalist, sent to interview the band ABBA. And I was so nervous and so scared.
Oh, wow.
In my early 20s, I was really nervous about this. And when I came back and I wrote my piece, my editor said to me, no, that intro is no good. He said, talk me through it. So I did. And he said, well, are there any other little bits? And I said, well, Frida did say she was going to go shopping for a pair of white boots. He said, that's your intro, that's your detail. You know, here's this woman with everything she might want, and all she wants is a little pair of white boots. And at the time I thought, heck, but actually he was right.
Yeah.
It's detail. The devil is in the detail. Definitely. And so my little interceptions in detail. And talking of detail, I mean, I do research my books usually quite thoroughly, but I went to, well, should I say, a lot of people went to a lot of trouble helping me, allowing me to interview them, so the local museum, but in particular for evacuees who are still alive in that area in their 90s, early 90s and mid 90s. And I was so moved by them and the things that they remember. So what one talked about how the men in the Italian prisoner of war camp sang in the evening, and all the children would stand outside and sing with them, and that is now a car park. So
wow,
I know, it's just I feel quite emotional about this book, and I also wanted to write about the Second World War and to take that story along, because I mean, I'm not shy about my age. I was born 10 years after the war ended, and my father used to talk about it a great deal, and I'd think, oh, boring. And then it was only when I got older that I realized it wasn't. It was fascinating.
Because that's one of the questions I was going to ask you was sort of how much research did you carry out for the book, and did you find out anything that sort of really shocked you? You said that you were sort of, you know, that was quite emotional, but was there anything that was sort of really shocking?
Yes, the thing that really shocked me was his discovery of Churchill's secret army. Because, as I said, I grew up with Daddy telling these stories about the war, and as I said, he passed away before Christmas, and he actually only got ill 6 weeks before he died. And when I was sitting by his bed, he asked me what I was writing about, and I said, Daddy, have you heard about Churchill's secret army? He said, well, of course I have, very brusquely, but he'd never mentioned it, you see.
No.
So what really shocked me was that these ordinary people were approached in the street. It could have been you, it could have been me, it could be anyone listening, and they were said, how do you want to help? You know, do you want to help us? And by the way, we're going to teach you how to kill someone with a gun or a knife. You're going to have to sign the Official Secrets Act. Here's a cyanide pill which you have to take if the Germans invade. You can't tell your family. So many people went to their graves without telling their families, and only now are stories beginning to trickle out, because these people have died, and most of them have died, and their descendants are finding diaries or whispered stories through the generations. So I spoke to two people whose one was a grandfather and the other was a great uncle, had been in the secret army.
It's so fascinating, isn't it? I think I've known Sidmouth, you know, since a child, going there on school trips and, you know, all those stuff, but you never sort of think that, well, I suppose also we didn't live through a war, so it's very difficult to imagine all these really, you know, sort of heroic and, you know, terrible things happening in a little seaside village, seaside town, where there's a real sense of community. But I guess that's probably why they, like you said, they did it that way, because it wasn't obvious.
No, yeah, exactly. Yes.
So yeah, I really loved Elizabeth's story. I loved how it was set in, you know, in Sidmouth in the past, and I bet for you that it was really fascinating. My granddad was an evacuee that came to Devon in the Second World War as a sort of, I think he was probably about 12 or 13, and he got put on a farm nearby to us. But he came back. He went home to London when he was, you know, at the end of the war, but then came back to Devon to work on the farm that and then stayed in Devon.
Amazing.
So yes, I mean, there's so many wonderful stories, isn't it? And this is a way to sort of tell them, really.
No, absolutely. And one of the evacuees that I interviewed, called Ivy, was evacuated down to what she called quite a posh house in Devon, very different from her home in London,
Yeah.
and went and loved it, went back to London to work and get married, and then decided 10 years ago that she'd actually like to spend her final days back in Sydenham.
Oh, that's nice.
It's very moving, isn't it?
Yeah. No, I think it is. And I think also, you know, I mean, my granddad was from sort of, you know, sort of sits, you know, proper, you know, he was a proper Londoner. And he came from a big family and, you know, had brothers and sisters, and he was just, they all went off to like different places. And so I think one ended up in Canada, and so they were all quite sort of spread out. But it was, yeah, really interesting that a lot of people chose to come back.
Yes.
Or stay. I think some of them stayed, didn't they? So
A lot of them did stay, absolutely, yes.
and you mentioned at the beginning that you worked as a writer in residence at the all male prison. I mean that obviously inspired Nancy's story along the way, but are any of the characters sort of based on real people, or are they all sort of
No, you had to be, no, I mean, you had to be terribly careful as a writer not to base things on real people. So I don't know where it comes from. You sit and you write and it just comes into your head, and it might be a tiny detail you've noticed from somebody a few years ago even. It's extraordinary how these seeds kind of bury themselves in the psyche and then decide they're going to grow when you're not really expecting it. So no, they're not. But I do really think myself into my characters. So Elizabeth's section starts when she's at a railway station in London, desperately looking for her son, who's gone just before he goes off to war, because she's finally finished knitting the scarf, but only finished it just after he left. And that's kind of me. I'm probably a smother mother. I'm far too, you know. Always being told by my children not to interfere. I could just see myself doing that.
That was incredibly moving. That I think for any, I think for any, you know, any parent who could imagine, you know, that their child going off to war when they were 17 years old, you know, then they're only just over being a child, aren't they? And well, not knowing.
And actually, one of the things that did inspire that is that my poor grandmother died of cancer at the age of 41 in 1940. My eldest uncle, her eldest son, was 17, and when she was alive, she made him promise that he wouldn't join up. As soon as she died of cancer, he considered himself to be exonerated from that. He promptly joined the RAF and was then shot down and was in a prisoner of war camp for the whole war, and nobody, his sister, my mother, and his two brothers and our father didn't know if he was alive or dead for a long time. And I grew up with that story, and I think part of that inspired. I mean, it hurts right here as I talk about it.
No, it is. That sort of, I mean, shit, because poor Elizabeth, I mean, she, I don't want to give too much away, but her husband's not massively supportive of her, is he? And he sort of, you know, thinks that, you know, I guess, which probably a lot of men did back then, you know, thinks he just, you know, he's going off to do his bit for the country, and she should, you know, pull her socks up and get on with it, really.
Stiff upper lip, yes.
And that was, you know, that was, so then she makes a choice, doesn't she, against him, actually, which I thought, good on you. To have some evacuees come and live with them, and that sort of takes that story off, doesn't it? That takes their story into a different direction.
Yes. I love writing about children. They also make fantastic unreliable characters. Because they can say things without meaning them, they can be very simplistic. But at the same time, I wanted to show the other side, the fact that many Germans were fighting because they felt they had no choice. And I have German friends, obviously, as like lots of people, and I wanted to show that side of it, which is why I bring in their teacher. I don't want to give too much away. I think I'll stop. But
Yeah.
okay. Yeah.
No, it's difficult, isn't it? It's always difficult when you're talking about crime books, which we do on this channel, you know, every week, more than once. But we like to give enough to sort of whet the appetite, but definitely not spoilers to you know, to spoil that. So going back to Nancy's story, which is really shocking, isn't it? Actually, I think, I mean,
Yeah.
your books, you know, you're not afraid to sort of tackle difficult subjects, are you, in your
No,
book at all?
no.
And what happens to her? So as we read the book, I was wondering how you managed to sort of drip in the little bits so that it was enough for us to know what was going on, but not for us to know exactly what went on. That was
Yeah. It's kind of, yeah, it's not the easiest thing to do. And sometimes I imagine it like cutting a slice of cake and then deciding actually that's too much for a plate. So I'm going to pare a bit and then pare a bit more. So in my first draft and in my second, there were more clues. And then I thought, no, you know, maybe not. And maybe I need to pare this down. And my editor agreed. So I ended up by shaving bits off,
yeah
not giving too much away at the beginning. And I think, you know, that's something that a lot of writers often do, actually. And then you realize you need to tease it out a bit more. And sometimes you can go the other way. Sometimes you can make the reader wait too long for these things to appear, and you don't want to do that. It's a really fine balance. But I'm no good at cooking. I'm no good at weighing ground. So, you know, we'll quite often fiddle around with this one.
So we know at the beginning of the book that there is a murder. We don't know who that murder is. We don't know who that involves or anything. But I think that was, yeah, I mean, I think that's always, you know, that sort of hook in, isn't it? And it's, you know, the book is fairly fast. Sorry, tractor now, I can hear it. It is, you know, it does hook you in quite, but I think I really liked the shared connect, although the murder is sort of central to the book. So I'm not going to give any more away than that. But there is a shared connection between the women, and that's Tall Chimneys. And you said about your house. So that was sort of based on what you found out about your house. And then was that sort of, did you sort of elaborate on that? Is it very much, is it like your house, or is it?
It is and it isn't. There are lots of things that are different about it. And as I said, I think what really inspired me was I've always felt houses have got vibes. Right through from my first bedsit, which I'm convinced was haunted, to wherever, really. I think that we possibly leave something of ourselves behind without wanting to sound too airy-fairy. I think we do.
I think it's, yeah. I think that's, sorry.
So whenever I move somewhere, I need to like the person who's selling it.
That's interesting. Yeah. No, I completely agree with vibes, because I haven't lived in many houses, but the one I'm in at the moment, I knew I mean, I grew up, my house belongs to my uncle, and I grew up coming here as a child, and then sort of life changed, and I ended up coming back to live here, and I always loved it. I always felt really, and my gran lived here when she was young.
That's lovely. That's
So I think and I've been in houses where there is a negative vibe. I don't know what it is, but
yes, absolutely, yes. And I do sense things like that. I mean, a few years ago, my husband and I and the dog went to visit a museum in Devon, actually, and I felt really cold, and the dog's hairs absolutely stood up on end. And the woman said, well, actually, behind that wall, and I won't tell you what happened, but it was a really, really nasty thing happened 200 years ago. But they didn't actually put that on a plaque because it was pretty grim. And as I went out of that museum, I got the most awful cold, and it just came on just like that, and it stayed with me for 3 weeks.
Wow.
And it's just, I do think that there are some people who are very sensitive to those things.
Yeah. Now, I used to work in a pub when I was in my teens, and it was a really, really old pub in Devon, and that was supposed to be haunted by a monk. and I just used to hate going up the stairs because it always felt, like you said, cold and
yeah, probably was, yes.
so yes, it's surprising. And I think houses, I mean, the house I live in is and you think about, even if you don't have any sort of beliefs in, what people do, there's, people, there's history here, isn't there, in the wars? Families have lived here, and there is things that have happened that you can't take away.
Yeah, words have been spoken in those walls.
Yeah,
might have been quite important. Yeah.
No, really fascinating. And I liked that because there's, with Elizabeth's story, there's also is it Adelaide?
Yes.
So she's quite a central character as well.
Yes.
So she is Nancy's grandmother.
Yes, she's Nancy's grandmother. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so it's difficult not to give too much away, but she that's how they are intertwined, but they're not. They are very separate in their sort of in the stories, aren't they?
And I wanted Adeline to show how difficult it could be for women in the war if they fell in love and if their husbands were away.
Yeah, her story's tragic, isn't it?
Yeah, yes, and yet also uplifting, I hope, in a way.
Absolutely, yes. It's towards the end, but actually when sort of. But I also think I really liked the relationship between her and Elizabeth, and how Elizabeth sort of goes against all that sort of the sort of that would have happened at that time, and basically says, well, you're my friend, I'm going to look after you, and again, which I thought was really, really lovely. And
thank you. I think that it's hard to imagine what it was like in convention at that time if a woman found herself pregnant. And I mean, I'll be totally honest. I was a very unexpected baby, and that was not done in those days.
No.
And even then, and my parents are married, but it was a very big deal. And in the wartime, it was huge, really huge, and women were looked down on if they got pregnant, especially if they were consorting with a German. I mean, I have a great friend whose father, who was English, met his wife who was German in Germany, and after the war brought her back to live in Wales, and she was tormented afterwards.
That must have been horrific. Yeah,
very difficult. Yes.
Yeah. Because I think people, we don't, as we were lucky, we didn't live through that time, but you don't know what people experienced in that time. And actually, people are people, it doesn't really. And I know back then it was, very clear cut that, these people were good and these people were bad, and depending on, what side you were on. But actually, those people also have stories. And as you say, some people didn't want to fight, they had to, so they ended up in a situation they didn't want to be in.
That's exactly, and that's what I wanted to bring across. I mean, there were some atrocities which were just horrendous, but at the same time, there were Germans who didn't want to be involved. Very difficult. Yeah.
But I mean, I can imagine in a small town in Devon, that probably that sort of resentment of that was probably even huge. Absolutely huge. And to sort of stand against that would have been a massive feat. You would have really been sort of pushing against the tide as such.
And that's what I wanted to bring across, because I like writing about strong women who are put in difficult situations. I've got a little notice on my kitchen that says, you never know. Oh no, sorry. It says a woman is like a tea bag. You never know how strong she is until you put her in hot water.
That's very true. And I think coming from, you've obviously had sort of, strong grandparents yourself, and, strong parents or female members of your family. I think that definitely leaves a mark on you, doesn't it? Having strong women in your family.
I actually only knew one grandparent. It was my paternal grandmother, and we lived with her from when I was born for the reasons I've just explained, and I adored her. She didn't want us to call her Granny because it made her feel too old, so she was known as Doris. And she was marvelous, and I would sneak up to her bedroom stroke sitting room in the evening, and we'd curl up together on the sofa and watch Coronation Street and Munch Quality Street. And she lived until she was 92, and she was amazing. But the interesting thing about her is that she wasn't terribly kind to her daughter-in-law, my mother, and my father would mutter darkly about two women in one kitchen. And yet my mother never discouraged me from loving my grandmother. So I think I grew up with a very strong matriarchal element. Also background where it wasn't peaceful and quiet. There was tension all the time. And I suppose I think I was absorbing it all.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because do you think that sort of comes out? I mean, I imagine that a certain element of yourself comes out in your writing, regardless of whether you want it to or not.
Yes, I think it. Yes, and yes, I think it probably does come out. Families are not simple in my family.
Yeah, well, I don't think anybody's are really, are they?
Well, some are simpler than others.
Did you always know how the book would end, or did that change in the editing process?
The thing about the ending is that I don't like to plan things out from beginning to end. I like to really know my characters. I need to know what their initial problems are and how they start to work them through. And as the book progresses, the ending slowly begins to form, and that's much more interesting for me. And so I knew I wanted it to end in an okay-ish way, the emphasis being on the ish. I didn't want it to be a gooey, it's all right, because a murder or two has been committed. And murder is heinous, murder is wrong. So no, I didn't know from the beginning, but I began to know as it went on. And then that final chapter where they're at a Remembrance Day service. I don't want to give too much away here, but that came to me right at the end when I did go to our I always go to our remembrance service, and we went outside in the churchyard, and everybody feels very moved. And then I went back and wrote that into it.
I think because I think the characters, I guess, so that do you find they sort of take on a life of their own as you're writing them?
Completely. And then you'll discover things that peel away. So the local museum was really helpful, and I spoke to the curator there. And again, going back to The Devil is in the Detail, he told me that members of Churchill's Secret Army were issued with a secret pin that they'd wear on their lapel, and very, very tiny, so people couldn't always see them, but those in the know would know what it was.
Yeah, interesting.
And I asked them to read the copy because I wanted to make sure everything was right. And I had to make one of the years slightly different because this pin actually wasn't issued till something like 1943 or even about 1943. And I had him wearing it the year before. So that had to be changed. So sometimes, in answer to your question about the ending, you have to move things around.
Yeah.
You've done some extra research. So I don't do all my research at the beginning and then write it. I will get interested in the story, and then I will research while I write. I might have done some beforehand, but I often research during it as well. And that kind of gives me an added incentive in a way and helps me think of different plots.
I guess, because I guess there's always the danger, isn't there, with research, is you're going to go too deep.
Yes, and I do that. And I could see myself doing that if I didn't. But much of it.
But I mean, in a subject that's something that's as fascinating as that, I imagine it's really hard to sort of, go, right, okay, well, I just need to know about this. Otherwise, because you could end up,
Yeah, very much so. And I think that's the thing about the Second World War. It's not too far away to research. And also, characters' feelings, emotions are the same now as they were 20, 50, 100 years ago. We still fear things, we're still excited about things, we're apprehensive about things, etc.
Yeah,
just the way they're phrased. But I think that people born before the Second World War and during the Second World War, one can identify with those because they are people we might have known earlier on in our family and not long ago.
No, exactly. It's current enough that most of us have got grandparents or great grandparents, even like my children grew up with my gran who lived until she was 95, and she'd lived through the war. So my children knew her as great granny. But so I mean, that's, which sadly, now will be the next generation will probably not have that, because there's not very many. It'll be our memories that we pass on from them, but it's not the same, is it?
And that's why we need to write them down. I mean, I keep saying this to everyone. I need to do it myself. Write down memories so that people have them written down.
That's really good advice. So looking at other characters in the book, so we're talking about the sort of strong women with Elizabeth and Nancy. We've got a couple of quite odious men in the book.
Yeah, haven't we? Yes.
I don't think we can fluff around that anyway, can we really? So Martin is the step brother of Nancy, and Duncan is his father, who was her stepfather, married to her mother. And again, I'm not going to give too much away, but they are both very unpleasant characters. I think we can say that.
Yeah, that's true.
Was that very difficult to write those in contrast to the sort of stories of the women?
I think what you have to do with unpleasant characters is not make them into pantomime Machiavellian like evil no-gooders. There's always got to be some kind of excuse or some reason. And I try, if somebody is unpleasant, to think about why they're being unpleasant. What is it in their background? And it's much better to give them a reason for it. So there are reasons for Martin's behaviour. There aren't any particular for Duncan, apart from the fact that he'd always wanted to marry Nancy's mother. And I tried to do that so that Martin wasn't totally nasty, and that actually Nancy, despite everything, has some feelings for him.
Yeah. I mean, he was he's definitely one of those characters that you love to hate, isn't he? And I mean, I think Duncan, he doesn't really have any redeeming features, does he, at all, really?
He doesn't really. But when I worked in the prison, I would help men write life stories, novels, short stories, letters home, and I would very often forget that I was perhaps in a room on my own without any guards, helping a murderer or a rapist do this, because the idea was that if they could write out what they had done, it might make them realise the severity of it, because some of the men would actually deny it. And I mean, one isn't going to say one has empathy, but when people tell you that they learnt how to commit a crime through their parents, almost at their mother's or father's knee, then you can see why it happened. That's different from condoning it.
Absolutely,
but what I wanted to do, I wanted to give a reason for someone behaving the way they do.
I think that comes over. I think particularly with Martin, you understand, even if you don't, like you say, you don't condone it, but you understand why he's like he is.
Triggered it, yes.
Did you have a favourite character to write? Who was your favourite? I mean, I was asking.
I think it's got to be Elizabeth. I'm fond of Nancy, but she's quite. How can I say it? I mean, both women are strong. But I really warm to Nancy. Sorry, to Elizabeth. Because that maternal fear, but then the bravery. The fact that she did something about it. And I like to think that there have been certain situations in life where I've been strong when I didn't think I could be strong. And
and she, I think both. I think that's why I like. I mean, quite often in your books, you do write about sort of strong women and strong women overcoming,
adversity.
Adversity that happen, sort of, and they're not sort of out of the way adversities. They're things that happen to people for whatever reason. And very,
Exactly.
so I really like that. And it's a really emotional book. There's parts of it that are shocking, parts of it that are emotional, but it's a real page turner. I absolutely loved it. And I really loved the Sidmouth, the historical part about Sidmouth, and I loved that sort of, because it felt really real, I think.
Yes, thank you. Well, I did consider making it into a made-up town, and I couldn't do it in the end. It was just too obvious that it was Sidmouth, so I just thought, blow it. And actually, a lot of authors do use real places.
Yeah.
And it's quite nice to identify with that. And in fact, there wasn't a secret army cell in Sidmouth. It was actually on the outskirts of Sidmouth. And but the woods, for example, around Sidmouth, they were used for these hidden rendezvous for people in secret. Yeah.
So it really was. Sorry, tractor again. It really was. I guess because it was a lot. I mean, well, people still do it now, where they go into sort of smaller places where they're less likely to be observed doing crime, aren't they? So that's still happening now, although in very different circumstances than it was then. You mentioned at the beginning about your writing as a writer in residence in a prison. Can you sort of tell us how that sort of came about? You said it was from when you got divorced, but
so this is going back to 2005, sorry. So my first marriage ended, and I did get support, I did get maintenance, but I still needed extra money because I had been writing a weekly column for a women's magazine for 10 years, and that's unusual for a column to go on that long. And that was an important part of our income. And then the editor left the same month that my marriage ended.
Oh, no.
And I was very worried because, as I said, although I had maintenance, I needed more to pay the mortgage of the house that I just bought, which I would not have bought if I'd known my column was going to end.
Yeah.
And so I was very worried. And then a neighbour of mine, as I said, this new place we moved to, said, well, you should look in the newspaper and check out the Guardian adverts. And I hadn't applied for a job for, I don't know, 20-something odd years, because I turned freelance when my eldest child was born. And there it was, wanted writers in the plural in residence, and it listed about 8 places in the country, including the prison, which was very near our old family house, which we'd had to sell, and the one where, I say the old family house, where we lived as a family for the previous 5 years. And I was really scared, and I didn't want it, but I just thought, well, my mother's phrase, necessity is the mother of invention, came into my head. My mother died also very young, but it was one of her phrases which has helped us get through. And so I applied, thinking, well, they won't want me because I've never even been in a prison. They'll want someone who's, I don't know, been a prison visitor or something. And to my horror, I got an invitation for an interview. And to my absolute horror, when I got there, I was so scared. And there was this prisoner who came very close up to me and started talking. I mean, literally like that, very close. And I stepped back, which apparently was the right thing to do because you have to be very careful of personal space. And anyway, when they rang and offered me the job, I was quite shocked. Actually, I didn't really want to do it. So I rang a cousin who said, he said, yes, go for it, Janie. It's a good idea. I rang my sister and said, you must be mad. So I took it. We do laugh about it now. But I had to take it because of the money. And then the strangest thing happened. When I got there, I was absolutely shaking like a complete jelly. And on that first day, they gave me the key talk, where they gave me a belt, a couple of keys, told me that I had to lock all the doors, and if I didn't, it'd be instant dismissal, and that if a key got stuck in a lock, I had to stay there with the key in the lock until somebody came along.
Oh my goodness.
I was told that there would not be anyone with me, when I did my workshops. No prison officer. The nearest one would be at the end of the corridor in the mess. And the strangest thing happened, probably almost by the end of that day, that I kind of almost, probably not by the end of that day, probably by the end of the week, I almost forgot that I was dealing with people who had committed these terrible crimes, because words are a great leveler. When you're helping people write a poem, helping them write their life stories, sometimes they can't write, so I was allowed to bring a computer in which wasn't connected to the internet. I was also encouraged to bring in writers to talk. So I knew Colin Dexter. He very kindly came in. I got the chap who wrote the dummy guide to something. I can't remember what it was now. I think it was cognitive behaviour. I got the dummy guide man to come in, and any writer friends who were mates to come in and talk. But Colin Dexter was the one that went down really, really well.
Oh, that's amazing.
So, yeah, I remember him, a question from, it was packed, his talk actually packed. And that was the one time when I did have officers there.
Yeah.
And so somebody said, so Mr. Dexter, where do you get your inspiration? And Colin said, from a very, and then he stopped, large, and you could just hear the tension bottle, and you could see the guards really, really getting worried here, of malt whiskey. And after that, he went down very well. But being very serious, what frightened me hugely was that many people were there because of drugs or drink. And I would go back and say to my children, please don't do either, really. I think I lost on the drinking bit, but but I have to say that I haven't drunk a drop of alcohol since I started working at the prison.
Wow, really?
Not a drop. And also, I worked at the high security prison in the afternoon, and I also worked at an open prison at the same time, which was very nearby. And a young man came up to me and said, Jane, I need you to know what I've done. And I'd say, please don't, because you didn't want to know what they did. If you knew that somebody had committed multiple rapes, it actually made it very difficult. It was hard to see them the same way. So this man told me that he'd been driving in a road doing 10 miles more than he should have been. So it was either 50 miles an hour or 40 miles an hour, I can't remember which. And this car came out of a side road, which my man said shouldn't have done. And he went into it and the driver died. And he said that, he was in prison for a year. And he said his punishment was knowing for the rest of his life that his actions had killed somebody. And a lot of us have done 10 miles more, but from that day, never.
No.
And it's almost that phrase there, but for the grace of God.
Yeah, it's just being in the wrong place, isn't it, at the wrong time, and that ends up with, and I imagine there's there's so many different people from different backgrounds for different reasons.
Yes, absolutely. And then I had the chairman of a company who said he was bored, so he went out and he held somebody up with a toy pistol.
Oh wow!
But then there was some really, really horrendous stories, which I don't talk about, which still haunt me.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. I'm just looking at the time, so we're coming up to 10 to 8, which is obviously time has flown. Are you writing at the moment? I know you write. You normally write about one book a year, don't you? So you generally have a book coming out. Are you writing now?
Yeah, I am, absolutely. So next year's book is almost done and dusted. I can't tell you anything about it, I'm afraid, but it's coming out next June. And I'm just about to start the one for the year after that. So yeah. Yes.
Oh, that's Oh, so we'll have to wait for a little bit longer to hear.
I'd love to tell you more. As soon as I'm allowed to, I'll send you an email.
Oh yeah, that'd be great. And sort of finally, before we go, what do you like to read, Jane? Have you read anything lately that you?
I just read all the time voraciously, but I read outside my genre. So when I say my genre, I'm not a bloody crime writer.
No.
I like to write about people who are affected by crime, and it could be families whose family have been devastated by someone who's tried to hurt them or has hurt them, families whose children have hurt them, and some people who perhaps commit a crime almost by mistake. So I like to read something completely different. And recently I've gone, I don't normally reread, but recently I've gone back to Maeve Binchy.
Oh, really? Oh, right.
Who
Yeah, I've
really
read some of
knows
those.
how to tell
Yeah.
a story. Real comfort read.
Yeah.
I've just finished a great book by Lucy Diamond. And you can ask what it's called now, and the title's gone completely out of my head. And it was a lovely story, really comforting. And I just like to read something completely different. Yeah, I
Yeah.
read a very moving book last week by Kit Duvall called The Trick of Time.
Oh,
Which,
yeah, I've heard of that. Yeah, because
yes,
she does write
just
quite moving books.
amazing, very moving, very hard hitting, but disguised by something that didn't make you think it was going to be quite so hard hitting. You knew there was something was going to happen. That really, really blew me away, actually. Yeah.
So you quite like to sort of mix your genres, really.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because you said right at the very beginning that you'd written, this is your 8th sort of crime thriller. I think you call them family mysteries, don't you, as well sometimes?
Family mystery thrillers, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
What did you wrote? So you wrote for Woman's Magazine, and then did you write other? Have you written other genres?
Well, I started. So I always wanted to write novels. I mean, that's why I became a journalist, because I knew, I thought I couldn't write a novel at 21. Now, when I give talks to schools, I think if people are moved to do it, then write however young you are. My granddaughter writes stories all the time in her little books. So I wrote, I started off writing romance. And I wrote one book a year for 12 years without being published when my children were growing up.
Wow.
I think partly because I didn't revise them properly. I was so thrilled to finish it. I'd sent it off to get an agent, and it didn't happen. Then I did get an agent, and I wrote a book and called Amersham Wives, about a journalist that swaps place with a housewife. And I got an agent, and she said, I'm sure we'll sell this, and it didn't sell. And it was in the days where they weren't digitally sent out. They were paper.
They were just
paper. So if it was well thumbed, an agent would know that it had done the rounds. And then I wrote a few more. And then I got accepted, and I was published by a major publisher for how many was it? 5 romance novels, and then by another one 4, and then it kind of petered. I mean, it's a very crowded market, mid-list romance.
Yeah.
And I thought perhaps my career was over. It was really rather depressing. And then, as I said, at the same time, got divorced, went to the prison, and then that led to a complete change of career.
Yeah.
So adversity, in inverted commas, can be a key.
Yeah, definitely. That's amazing. An amazing story. That's absolutely fascinating. And thank you for sharing with us that story, but also Coming to Find You, which is out now in paperback. I believe it is in paperback, isn't it?
It is paperback. It's also available as an ebook too, and as an audio. And I'm allowed to say it's on sale. Today's publication day, so it's lovely to share.
Oh, congratulations! I looked online and it said it was the 15th, and I thought, so did they move it?
No, it's an ebook last week, and
so congratulations!
Thank you. It's very exciting. It always feels a bit unreal. Very exciting. So it's on sale nationwide, bookshops, supermarkets, Tesco, Asda, Sainsbury's, and as an ebook, and booksellers everywhere. So I'd love to know what your audience thinks of it.
Yes. I mean, I absolutely loved it. And my review was glowing, because I was completely immersed in it. So Sam's just saying thank you for a great hour, and congratulations on publication day, Jane. So yes,
thank you so much, Samantha. That's really kind. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us, Jane, and good luck. I'm not sure you won't ever need it, because your books are always amazing anyway.
Good luck's always good to have. So thank you very much for having me. You're a great interviewer, and this group is fantastic. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you, Jane. Bye-bye. Bye, everybody. Bye.